Well, hello everyone, and welcome today to today's Chamber Connect. I'm Cecilia Harry. I'm Chief Economic Development Officer here at the Chamber and EDC. And before I go over some housekeeping items and introduce today's program, I wanted to share some exciting news that we received earlier today that was announced internationally related to the economic development efforts and opportunities in the Colorado Springs region. The Site Selectors Guild, which is a international, well-known, well-respected group of consultants that help businesses choose their locations for growth and expansion, announced Colorado Springs as one of the top mid-sized cities for new projects. They just released some information, data, and research related to the pandemic and what they're seeing in terms of shifting with business location decisions. And the sum of it is that the big cities are out and the mid cities are in. So we're in a really good position, and it's wonderful to have that press, and it's exciting to share all of that with you today. So today's topic is legislative affairs. We're going to have an update with several folks from their areas of expertise, and we will be here until 12:30 today. It's an interactive session, and so we encourage you to ask questions and to post your questions in the chat at any time. You can address them to everyone in the chat or specifically to Emma Mitchell, and our team will make sure that they get asked in the order that they're received at the end of the session. And we're recording this presentation, and it will be available to the public to view by next week. In the Zoom program, we ask that you rename yourself with your name and your company name. And this is because we will be drawing a winner for a special prize through the program. So renaming yourself will help us identify the winner when that time comes. And we have a new event coming up that we are pleased to announce. It's called the Small Business Roundtable. It is a support group for small businesses around business recovery. This new offering will be 1 hour long and once per month. And the goal is for it to be a confidential place to talk through your challenges with other small business executives and learn from each other. And we will have a different topic each month. And we will have various discussion moderators that are also community leaders, such as Bob Kittredge with Focus Point Solutions, Chris Cipoletti with the Pioneer Fund, Neil Arthur with Arthur Biz, Michelle Tellerico with the Picnic Basket, Naomi Montez with Month Wealth, and Ryan Garner with Hub International. So look at your calendars and mark the first roundtable for July 30th. It'll be 11:30 to 12:30, and attendance is limited to 25 people to facilitate dialogue, and you are welcome to attend as many or as few as you like. So take a look at that, and we hope if it fits your needs that you join us in the future there. I'm now going to read a word from our sponsor of this Chamber Connect, and that is community partner BBSI. BBSI is a local high-touch professional employer organization advocating on behalf of business owners. And our Colorado Springs team of subject matter experts provides consulting services to help propel small to medium-sized businesses through challenges in the areas of workers' compensation, risk management, human resources, payroll, talent acquisition, and business consulting. And they help to ensure compliance, mitigate risk, and help companies scale for growth. You can reach out to Kevin.Davis at BBSI for a zero-pressure discussion on how the company can assist with your company's needs. And we'll make sure that Kevin's email address makes it into the participant chat. And now for today's presentation. Again, the topic is Legislative Affairs Update. And I'm going to hand it over to Kyle Blakely to say hello and introduce the panelists. Kyle.
Thanks, Cecilia. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this legislative wrap-up. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. Look forward to hearing your questions. And we have three great panelists with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and have them introduce themselves first before I get started with the first question.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Beck, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC. Thanks for being here.
Hi, everyone. Clarissa Thomas, Vice President of Public Policy with the Pikes Peak Association of Realtors. And thank you for having me. And I hope that this is a lively discussion with everyone.
Hi, Ryan Klein. I'm an attorney with Sherman and Howard.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. We're going to start this off. Rachel, I'll have you take the first crack at this first question because this this year's legislative session was pretty unique and kind of historic in several ways. So can you kind of tell us what set it apart from past sessions?
Well, you're right, Kyle. It was a historic session. Normally the legislature meets from January through May for 120 consecutive days. And this year, just like everybody else, they had to shut down the Capitol and quarantine themselves. And so because of that several week break that they took, the Supreme Court actually had to get involved and decide how it was going to work if they took a pause in the middle of the session. There's language in the Constitution and in statute, believe it or not, that specifically dictates when they can meet. And so they waited for a ruling on that from the Supreme Court, just to make sure if they passed any bills after a certain point that they wouldn't run into legal challenges. And despite that 3-week break, they still managed to set a record for the number of bills introduced. Normally it's anywhere from 500 to 700, and they topped that this year. So they managed to be a very busy bunch despite that interruption.
So what happened after the legislature came back? What after the quarantine? Tell us a little bit about that. That was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, the Capitol in a lot of ways is an old-fashioned place. Everybody does the work there in the Capitol. You really have to be present. Things move quickly. If you're not there, you might not get the text of an amendment, for example. It might show up on the legislature's website a week later, but by that time it's a moot point. So I think they had a little bit of trouble adapting. We're all used to technology, but that's not a place where that was the order of the day. So a lot of legislators were working from home. We employ 2 lobbyists full-time, working on behalf of the chamber and all of you, a Republican and a Democrat. We were all lobbying by text and by email and by phone, rather than the usual way, which is, hunt people down in the hallways of the Capitol. There was the leadership had said after the break that they were going to focus on bills that were fast, friendly, and free. And we were pretty pleased to hear that they were really going to focus on economic recovery. They had to deal with more than 300 bills that were in process, kind of killed most of those. And they started working on cutting $3.3 billion from the state budget, which is a really big job that I certainly did not envy them. To put that in perspective, that's about 30% of the state's general fund operating budget. What we saw, though, unfortunately, was the bills were not fast, friendly, and free. Well, they certainly were moving fast, but they were neither friendly nor free. We did see a lot of bills that will add costs or administrative burdens to businesses. We also saw things moving through really quickly with very little or no stakeholder input. And that, I think, is a real shame.
Clarissa, thanks for joining us today. Can you talk a little bit about some of the bills that passed this year that impacted your industry?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the same vein of what Rachel is saying, I think our industry, we cover all things real estate, whether it's home ownership, what the consumer is looking for, and also protecting realtors and anyone within that affiliate network, whether you're lenders, we all work together within the housing industry. At any rate, we were hopeful that, considering the message that was sent in a very abbreviated session after COVID shutdowns, that we were going to see something very bipartisan, very friendly, something that was not going to cost the consumer that much, nor businesses. But instead, we saw a lot of very reactionary advocacy from all of our business entities trying to band together and try to stop excessive regulations, and one of them, taxation. And our businesses are struggling in the Pikes Peak region, just like they are everywhere else. We all ended up banding together. And I bring this up because one of the biggest bills I think that we all worked for was 1420. And it was not to support it. It was to try to stop our businesses from actually having to pay additional financial burdens by way of federal pass-through taxes that they benefit from. And that would have been taken away to shift towards a recovery effort for the state education fund. So I've never seen advocacy so swiftly within all of the business chambers. So all of the chambers throughout the state, your chamber was the leading banner that ended up advocating for businesses and then got realtors locally. We activated at the state level. Our state chambers ended up working for that. So that is like all encompassing, but that's one of the bills that we worked on. Then we really didn't have much, I'm not going to say success, because we did have success at amending things, not being for or against, but we had no other choice than to work on amending legislation that wouldn't be so extremely adverse to homeowners and to consumers that, it sounds good to do certain things, but then when the regulatory structure is put in place, it has unintended consequences that people can't recover from. So we worked on amending legislation as much as we could so that we knew it was going to pass. So let's just not make it such that it puts people out of attainable housing. We hear rent control is really good because it keeps prices down. It really isn't. There's so much research out there that rent control policies do not promulgate favorable affordability for people. So that's one of our things that we were working on, to make sure that whatever passed was amended to be within the confines of still allowing people to be able to afford housing. And so those are some of the things that we worked on. And like I said, it was not really celebrating successes, but we celebrated amendments and legislation that got passed, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you very much. Ryan, what were some of the bills that impacted the Home Builders Association this year?
Yes, well, a little background. One of the areas I practice is construction. I'm also general counsel and a board member of the Colorado Springs Housing and Building Association. The session started out looking really, really bad for the home building industry. And if you're not in there and thinking, why does that matter to me? Some of these bills would have drastically increased the costs of houses, especially new houses. And as we talk about expanding the city and looking at new businesses moving here, cost of living obviously is important if we're going to try to get the type of companies and employees to move here. So when the session started out, it looked bad. We had bills that looked about changing how payments were done on construction jobs. There was a bill out there that would have dealt with the arbitration process. The plaintiffs' bar has always been trying to chip away at the right of the building industry to rely on arbitration. And it would have expanded beyond just construction. It would have included all kinds of consumer arbitration provisions. There was also a very bad bill that would have changed the time limits on when parties can bring construction defect actions, to almost extend them to an exceedingly long period of time. That was one of the bills we were most concerned about. And then there was also a worker compensation bill that would have dealt with the construction industry and other industries as well. Luckily, all those bills were killed at some point during the session. We expect them to be back next year. We see them usually every year. That was the good news. As far as what impacted the construction industry, the only real substantive bill that specifically to us that passed was a bill on energy efficiency that deals with what builders have to offer as far as solar panel options, car charging options, and oddly enough, electric heating options. Other than that, there wasn't too much that directly impacted construction industry, although kind of as mentioned before, there's a lot of other bills that impact taxing, paid sick leave, that I'm sure we'll talk about later in this program, and unemployment insurance that impacted us. We were luckily able to escape most of that. One other thing, not directly legislative, but we were facing a fairly worrisome growth initiative that had passed in other municipalities in the state, most recently Lakewood. That would have limited new permits to 1% of the current stock of houses, which would have drastically slowed building in the community. That was an initiative that was going to go on the ballot. Luckily, that died during ballot initiatives and getting signatures. We were slightly concerned when the governor had the electronic signature executive order before that got shut down by the Colorado Supreme Court. So that issue, I think we've avoided for this year, again, for 2 years in a row, although we expect that issue to more than likely prop up again next year.
Nice. Thanks, Ryan. Rachel, what were some of the other bills this year that just impacted businesses in general?
Well, as Clarissa mentioned, that tax bill was probably what took up most of our time and concern. The price tag on that one started off at a cost to business of $1.2 billion, and we were able to get that down to $180 million. So, I share Clarissa's thought. In a lot of ways, it feels like, we weren't very successful this session because we have high standards. We like to kill bills like that entirely. But she's right. The best we can do sometimes is just to mitigate the effects that they'll have on the business community. So some of the things that came out of that bill include, we will not be accepting some of the federal CARES Act aid that was specifically created to help businesses stay afloat by Congress with bipartisan support. There's going to be some changes to the losses that you can deduct on your taxes, which of course is a problem right now when so many businesses are running losses and need those deductions in order to maintain some cash flow. There will also be some changes to some pass-through deductions that LLCs and sole proprietorships particularly use. But we were able to amend out a few things, two of which were of specific concern to our region. One was getting rid of a tax credit for energy used in manufacturing. And all of you probably know that advanced manufacturing is one of the key industries that we're trying to develop in the region. It helps us diversify our employment base. And that would have been a real problem, particularly for the smaller manufacturers. And a little side note here, one of the things that we did this session, which we often do, is ask our members to reach out directly to their representatives and tell them how these things will affect your businesses. And one of our Government Affairs Council members, who owns a manufacturing firm in town that employs 28 people, wrote to, I think, everybody under the Capitol. He didn't stop at our local representatives. And somebody, one of the representatives from outside our region, actually read the text of his email during House debate on the bill. So just goes to show you that you really can make a difference when you write to your legislators. But returning to your question, Kyle, there were a number of other bills. Ryan touched on a couple of them that will affect the cost of doing business. There were some changes to unemployment insurance. We'll see the cost of that go up, partly just because of the high unemployment rate that we have seen because of the pandemic, but also thanks to some legislative changes. There'll be some increased costs to providing health insurance to your employees. And all employers now will be required to provide paid sick leave to employees. That was a bill where the main premise was not a problem. I think probably all of you already provide sick leave to your employees, partly because you don't want them to show up at work when they're ill. But that bill had all sorts of other provisions in there that were concerning. It says that employees can use that mandatory leave time for all sorts of other purposes and for all sorts of people that may or may not be related to you in a legal or biological way. So a very expansive program. It's something that we've seen in sessions past and fought off successfully. And it felt particularly disingenuous this year because sponsors had just said, we've been working on this for years and we cannot get a consensus on this. So we're going to give up for this year. And then we turn around and see a lot of those provisions in that bill. So number of things there that will increase costs, again, at a time when businesses can least afford it and don't need to be figuring out, what new paperwork they're going to have to do when they're just trying to keep the doors open and the lights on.
Great. So some of these things from a cost standpoint, we had the presentation from the Common Sense Institute last week, and they talked a lot about kind of what the fiscal impact is of all this stuff. What are some of those numbers? I know you mentioned somewhere in there we were able to get one impact of one bill down from 1.2 billion to 180 million. But what are some of the other possible impacts there?
I've actually got that chart queued up here. So let me share this estimate for you. And I'll see if I can make this a little bigger here. Well, there we go. So you can see here what Kyle's referring to. There's a nonpartisan think tank called the Common Sense Institute that did some work to estimate how much these bills and also some ballot initiatives we're going to cost the business community. And so these are the original costs. As Kyle said, we did a lot of work collectively as a business community. We partnered with other chambers, as Clarissa said, industry groups, and other chambers around the state. And we're able to reduce a lot of these costs, but it gives you an idea there of just the sorts of dollar figures that we're talking about. And one of the reasons that we get concerned about stuff like this is, it can be death by 1,000 cuts. Ryan talked about the cost of housing and how that affects businesses of all sorts, not just the construction industry. And from an economic development perspective, we are competing with other states, not just to bring new businesses here, but also to keep the businesses that we have. So I mentioned earlier the proposal to get rid of a tax credit for energy production used in manufacturing. There was another that we successfully fought off that got rid of a tax credit for regional home offices. That would have cost USAA locally $9 million a year alone. These are the kinds of things that make people pack up their businesses and go elsewhere. And sometimes it can be done in a single cut like that, $9 million per year hit. But often it's the things that you see on this list here. And you can see where they've come up with the amount per Coloradan. Those things slowly start to add up. And as our cost of living, for various reasons, like these sorts of measures, like the requirements on builders that Ryan talked about, we are losing that affordability edge that we have depended on, particularly in Colorado Springs for a long time, to help us stand out when we compete in other states for business, or as we try to keep businesses here.
Great, thank you. And it's kind of indicative of some of the things you guys have talked about. The last couple of years with the change in the legislature, the House, the Senate, and the governor's office, we've talked about the need for at least at the Government Affairs Committee at the Chamber, we've talked about the need for playing a little bit more defense. And that's where getting some of those bills down to where there's some compromises to make them a little more palatable, things like that. Sometimes, as we've said, those things are little victories, which is, in some ways, most of what we can hope for over the next few years. But what are some of the good news things in your mind? I know we've talked a little bit about them, but Ryan, we'll start with you. What are maybe some of the highlights or the one or two things that you think are the most good news that came out of this year's session?
Well, first and foremost, what I mentioned before, all the bills that died, especially for the construction industry. I think there were certainly some wins, and maybe I'm stealing some of Rachel's thunder, so I apologize, Rachel. One being the paid sick leave. So I'm also a member of the GAC, and we knew coming down that with the pandemic that was more than likely going to pass. We could read the tea leaves, and so we evaluated the best defense is to try to amend it. So one way we were able to amend it was to work with our lobbyists to add a provision in there that federal contractors who are already providing sick leave under the executive order that came out of the Obama administration would essentially have a pass for that bill because they're already having that on top. And there was concern that, one, how do those match up? Two, what about stacking of having to be back to back? And as we work here as a chamber to try to get Spacecom here on a permanent basis, the last thing we want to do is to be penalizing our government contractors and making the Springs be a less attractive option for permanent space command. So I thought that was a good win, not a complete win on paid sick leave, but I think about as good as we were going to get. I won't touch on it in detail because I want to let Rachel talk about it since it's her baby. But we had the credential portability program, which also ties in with Spacecom and trying to make sure that Colorado Springs is the most attractive option. So I think those are two things we can view as wins, maybe as much as we were going to get, given this session, the way it was looking and the way that happened after the pandemic and it reopened. But certainly some things I think we can count as successes for the year.
Great, thanks. Clarissa, what about you? What do you feel like are the one or two most important things that happened?
Sure. I mean, yeah, in the midst of a lot of negative business impacts, our industry actually benefited from the COVID-19 crisis, creating an opportunity for us to actually get a law enacted that allows for remote notarizations in the real estate industry. And some people say really, that's not happening because it happens somewhere else. But Colorado finally enacted remote notarization. So for a military community as high as we are, that is a great perk, because if you're transacting with somebody that's transferring or moving out, and a member of the military needs to close on a property, some of them are purchasing houses and selling their houses without being in town, right? Well, Colorado was not able to do that. So now we can allow for, and that is possible to do with the work of the Secretary of State's office and through them. And obviously the governor was willing to enable this to pass, but it took, I think our industry lobbied for that for about 4 to 6 years. So, it took a pandemic for the real estate industry in Colorado to be able to claim a victory regarding remote notarization.
Great, thank you. Rachel, what about you? What are you kind of most proud of from the session, or happiest about?
I think there are a few bright spots. One big fight that we were expecting going into the session was a public health care option that had been proposed last year by the state at the governor's direction. And it was going to be a pretty expensive proposition, particularly for business. And there really wasn't a lot of research done or groundwork laid on how it would work. So we were pretty nervous about a lot of unintended consequences. And thanks to the pandemic and the price tag that was attached to that, that's been tabled. Maybe not forever, but we live to fight another day. Ryan mentioned a credentialing bill. This was a bill that was in process before the quarantine break, that said that made it a lot easier for folks who work in licensed or credentialed professions in other states to bring their licenses here. And really it was designed as a workforce bill. Prior to the pandemic, we had very low unemployment. And while that's largely a good thing, it also means that a lot of our businesses were saying to us, hey, I can't get any good help, or I can't keep employees because there's so much competition for them. So when the Space Command basing criteria came out, our Chief Defense Development Officer, Reggie Ash, said, hey, one of the criteria here is care of military families in the community. And specifically under that heading was military spouse licensures. And what can we do about this? So we'd hope to get a bill that would have some that would focus entirely on that issue. But given the unique dynamics of this session, that wasn't going to be possible. So what we did instead was work to attach some language into that bill that was already in process. And what it says is, if you are a military spouse and you have a license in another state, with a couple of minor exceptions, as long as you're in good standing, your license, your credential comes here to Colorado and you can get to work right away. So that's a huge win for military spouses. It's great news for employers who would like to employ folks working in those professions. And as Ryan said, that's going to help us be more competitive as we try and make sure that Space Command headquarters stays in Colorado Springs. And then perhaps the most exciting win of the session, in my opinion, is we were able to successfully extend permission for restaurants to serve alcoholic beverages to go. I don't know how many of you are taking advantage of that. Personally, I think it's a bright spot in the pandemic. And I'm joking, but of course, that's a really important one to restaurants who've been so hard hit by all of this. That's where they make a lot of their profits. And so that was an important one for them to help them stay afloat. So we're real proud of that one.
Yeah, I've taken advantage of that. We have a great margarita spot within walking distance of our house. So thank you for that. So one thing I was just thinking about dawned on me, and I can't remember, I think it was mentioned at one of our GAC meetings, but is there still a possibility the legislature, I mean, they still have some days left in the session that they can use. They could convene again yet this year before January, correct?
Yeah, and Ryan, chime in here as our resident attorney. But that Supreme Court case that I mentioned said that the legislature can use those 120 days when they want to. Traditionally, as I said, that's been consecutive. They've been consecutive. the Supreme Court ruled they do not have to do that anymore. And so if I remember correctly, they've got more than 30 days left. I knew that number off the top of my head and I've forgotten. Clarissa or Ryan, maybe you can chime in. So they could potentially go back into session and use some of those days. The latest rumor I'm hearing is that's probably not going to happen, but it is a possibility.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
Clarissa, were you going to add to that? I saw you unmute there.
Yeah, no, I mean, Rachel just summed it up. And so they can loosely reconvene. And as I think we discussed last week during the GAC meeting, that it would be very focused if Polis really does consider reconvening the session. It would have to be him calling them back into order, and it would be for a very focused purpose. Hopefully it doesn't happen, because it was a crazy session for the 2 or 3 weeks that we had them a couple of weeks ago.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on from the legislature, let's talk a little bit about ballot issues coming up this fall. Rachel, I'll let you start. What are some of the key things that we're going to be seeing on the ballot or still may potentially hit the ballot?
Well, it's going to be a crowded ballot. We know that. There's everything on there from shall we reintroduce wolves to shall we change our taxing structure. And there are, I think, 3 that we're particularly interested in at the Chamber and EDC and have taken positions on. The Government Affairs Council heard from proponents and opponents of all of these and then made a recommendation to the board on whether we should support or oppose them. So one of those I mentioned earlier, there's been a proposal in the works for a number of years to mandate paid family and medical leave. That employers would have to provide that to employees. And without getting too much into the details, it's not necessarily the concept that we have an issue with, but it's how they're proposing to implement it. It would be the most expansive and expensive program in the country. And that's an area where maybe we don't want to be on the bleeding edge, particularly again, right now, new costs, probably not a great idea as we're trying to restart the economy. There's also a measure, again, that we've seen before that would ask voters to approve a graduated income tax. Right now, Colorado has a flat income tax. It's a little over 4%. This proposal would raise that income tax on joint filers making more than $250,000 a year, and it would decrease it slightly for some low income earners. Now, one of the problems with that from an economic development perspective is as we try to attract high paying jobs, particularly in educated professions, that's a real disincentive. There are also a lot of small businesses that kind of hover on that $250,000 threshold. And so, if they're close and they have a good year and they're bumped into that higher tax bracket, we're penalizing them for growing. And certainly as a chamber and EDC, that is not the kind of policy that we want to promote. And then the last one, so we're opposing that one. And we are supporting a proposal that would change a tax provision that's been really important to businesses. We've all hated what's known as the Gallagher Amendment for decades. It means that businesses are shouldering a really high proportion of the property tax burden in the state. And it's caused a lot of problems in the state budget that have had some domino effects when it comes to funding education and other things. And so voters will be asked to repeal that. I think it's a long shot. It's really complicated tax policy, and it essentially means that residential property owners are going to have to pay a little more. But I think if ever there was a time to make that more fair for businesses, now's our shot, because people have seen, either some of you have experienced it directly, or maybe you've had a friend or a neighbor that owns a business and seen what they've gone through lately.
Great, thank you. Real quick, I have one more question before we'll open it up to the questions from those who joined us. Kind of looking toward next year, Clarissa, I'll start with you. Any particular issues or bills that you see that might be coming around next year that you're hearing about that might impact the real estate industry? Just kind of looking ahead, what do you see out there?
Well, for us, the primary thing, Ryan talked about it, but the primary thing would be that Fast and Furious would be for them to reintroduce any modifications to construction defects. So I know that we will be monitoring that since they couldn't get much done with it this year and it failed. We think it's going to be back next year. We also worry about the same that I mentioned before, rent control and any of those types of provisions that on the surface sound like they provide some sort of housing affordability resolve, but in reality, they have a counterproductive effect. So we would be monitoring that again. We would also be looking for any type of modifications that, to a homeowner association covenants and rules and regulations that instead of helping neighborhoods would actually be counterintuitive to good public policy. And of course, the biggest one for us, and this is one of the unifying points for us with the chamber, is any taxation policy that becomes so burdensome that it doesn't help to help us promote a good economic policy for us to do business retention and any of that sort of public policy that we would do for our region to help it stay vibrant.
Thanks. Ryan, how about you from the HBA side? Anything in particular for next year that you guys are on the lookout for?
Yeah, so what Clarissa mentioned first, construction defects. We always worry when the shoe is going to drop on that, given the current makeup of the General Assembly of being one-party control. We're concerned about that again for next year. They're always trying to chip away at the rights of arbitrations in various different fashions. I think we'll see in the same bill again next year. Particularly, they want to get after a case that we were able to get successfully pushed through the Supreme Court called Bellagio, which had to do with protections of arbitrations in multifamily units, which as the state grows and tries to attract people, the ability to build multifamily units, especially like condominiums, to try to attract younger talent here is something of importance. But without cases like that to protect the home building industry, a lot of builders just aren't doing it, particularly here in the Springs, unless on a high end. But trying to get that kind of sweet spot of getting ones that are affordable to get the 25 to 35-year-olds to move here from the coast to work in the tech industry or other similar industries like that is important. And then finally, the one that we've been worrying about very drastically for years is what I mentioned earlier, that growth initiative. This is the second year we've had to fight it. We were anticipating having to really fight it if it made it on enough signatures to be on the ballot. Luckily, this is the second year that so far we've skated on that, but we anticipate that the same people that done in the past are going to do it next year, and we're going to have to fight that again. And if that sounds great, of having an initiative to not have as many people come here because you're here, that sounds good and all, especially if you're driving in traffic. But the ramifications to our building industry, first and foremost, and our industry overall would be greatly impacted, especially as we're trying to draw companies, especially great companies offering good high-paying jobs here, and especially Spacecom. If we could only build 1% in El Paso County, that would greatly hamper our ability to get something like Spacecom here on a permanent basis.
Great, thank you. Rachel, what about you?
What was the question, Kyle? I'm sorry, I was listening.
What are you most on the lookout for next year when they reconvene? Kind of what's coming up? What worries you? What what interests you? What do you see coming?
Well, I certainly would echo what Ryan and Clarissa said, and also I'm really concerned about what's going to happen with the state budget and what domino effects will come out of that. You know, as I said, cutting $3.3 billion out of the state budget was a huge job. And a lot of those one-time tricks and funding, moving shell games, tricks that they used to balance the budget this year are not going to be available to them next year. And that tax bill that we all talked about so much at the beginning of this program was kind of set up as, oh, well, we have to take these tax breaks away from businesses to balance the budget. And it was framed as an education funding measure. And I worry that we'll see more of that next session because, typically these sorts of recessions last 2 or 3 years. And so the state budget next year is going to be painful as well. And I think that there are some legislators who will try and use that as justification to make some of these changes that they have wanted to do all along. Or folks who legitimately say, well, you know, we've got tough choices to make in the budget, and so we're going to take away some of these tax breaks from businesses. And we, of course, know that all that does is hurt the economy, and the domino effects of that, they're not helpful.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Emma, I'm gonna turn it over to you we'll start taking some of the questions from the folks who've joined us.
Sure. So first of all, I wanted to, Kyle, ask you to pick a 2-digit number so we can do our raffle.
A 2-digit number,
Yeah, just
just
any two,
randomly off the top of my head.
please. Yes.
27.
All right, perfect. We will announce that in a minute. The first question was, do you mind talking about the health insurance cost increases?
Rachel, do you want to take that?
Sure. So the proposal that we worked against was to set up a new state enterprise that would charge a fee on hospitals and on insurance companies, and those dollars were going to be, to make a long story short, passed on to employer-provided healthcare providers, health coverage plans. That bill would have set up a separate board to oversee spending, and it was supposed to help cover the cost of reinsurance. And the idea behind that is that state government creates a pool of money that can pay for a significant portion of the most high-cost individual claims after those costs reach a certain level. So essentially what it boils down to is some cost shifting. Health insurance is much more expensive on the individual market, and this is a way to shift some of that cost onto employer-provided health plans.
Great, thank you. Next question.
Okay. How and when is an appropriate time to get in touch with elected officials and be noticed? There was discussion about one of the members of the GAC having their email read from the floor of the session. How do we make that happen as the general public or business owners?
Clarissa, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, one of the things that we always encourage, at least what Rachel and the GAC have always encouraged chamber members, and for the realtors, we do the same, is our voice is only as good as we make it. And it's a citizen legislature. Legislators expect their fellow citizens to participate in the public process. So if we ask you to mobilize and contact legislators, do it. It's intimidating, hands down. Some people have almost put legislators in a pedestal like they're unreachable. But again, I repeat, it's a citizen legislature. So if we tell you, please reach out to the following members, and the chamber is pretty good about giving you their emails and their phone numbers. So it's as simple as calling them. We can even help you draft the talking points if you need that. I know that through the GAC, we've done that. And it helps us to have talking points, because then you stay to the message that we're trying to advocate and convey certain points. So with that, if there's a call for action, that's when you as a citizen and as a business owner ought to stand up and respond to that call for action. If you don't have a particular business issue that you're advocating for or against, don't hesitate to reach out to your legislators as well. I think the chamber has links on how to contact your legislators. So establish a relationship with them, because again, it's a citizen legislature, and those relationships are what make us successful as businesses and organizations when we're looking for the help to either pass something or defeat something. And I know that it sounds very Pollyanna-ish, but it really is as simple as that. Just look for the phone numbers or their emails and reach out to them and say, hey, I'm Joe Smith from Colorado Springs. I'm a citizen and I really care about the following issues. Can we meet? Can we visit about this issue that I'm very particularly interested in? And more than likely, your Pikes Peak area legislators are going to respond to that. Don't come across as a kook on something. And I do say that because they'll probably ignore you. But if you're a concerned business owner and citizen, they're going to take the time to respond to you because it's a citizen legislature. And so the operative term is they're citizens responding to citizens.
Great. Thank you. Rachel, do you want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Part of why the Chamber and EDC exists is that we bring together all of your voices and put that, there's strength in numbers. And so we try and offer programs throughout the year that help you make those contacts with legislators. And, as Clarissa said, we know that can be intimidating sometimes. And so, we try and do telephone town halls, especially now when that's our only option. So all you have to do is call in. You can just listen if you want to. We also offer, before the session begins, we do a legislative roundtable. Traditionally, we jokingly call that legislators speed dating around the office because we put y'all in small groups, which again, I think reduces that intimidation factor and lets you just have some more informal conversations with these folks. And we move them around from group to group so that you get to speak to a number of them. What that'll look like now, thanks to the pandemic and prohibitions on group gatherings, I don't know, but I do know that Nora and Emma and Stephanie have been working really hard to move our programs to online formats so that you can still take advantage of that kind of thing.
Great. Thank you. Emma, next question.
Oops, just lost my questions. Who are the pro-business advocates in the Senate and House? Who do we need to recognize for their support of business?
Ryan, who do you guys look to as being like the most supportive in our contingent?
I'm sure Rachel probably knows better than me. I'll single out one person because he's an attorney and I know him. Bob Gardner, who last year went to extreme lengths to protect businesses with paid sick leave. In fact, even commencing a lawsuit. I think he's been a great advocate for interests that have impacted the community, impacted businesses, and been very good in helping us try to fight anti-business measures and push pro-business measures. So I would definitely single out Senator Gardner as somebody who's been very, very beneficial to the business community.
Great. Clarissa, what about you? Clarissa?
Oops. Did I unmute myself? Okay, there we go. I echo Senator Bob Gardner. He has been instrumental in protecting business interests through and through for years in the Pikes Peak region. I know that we're obviously talking about this area, but sometimes we kind of forget that just a little south, we've got somebody that used to be a commissioner for El Paso County, and now he represents a Senate district that is more than just El Paso County. It bleeds over into a neighboring community, but that's Dennis Heisey, and he's actually been pretty good for business issues in general. Another one that I would think of when we use teachable moments for him, and I'm not saying that condescendingly, but Senator Pete Lee has been at times difficult to convey the message because even though he's a friend of businesses in general, he actually has promoted a lot of things that are detrimental to the business sector. So when I say a teachable moment, it really is important to talk to him and tell him, listen, I know that this is your party and your party favors all these excessive regulatory burdens, but please, Pete, see the other side. And I know that as realtors, once upon a time, he was a realtor member, and we didn't support him when he ran for the House on the first go around. We had to work with him extensively to get him to understand why realtors didn't support transfer taxes, why we didn't support rent control, why we didn't support construction defects the way that they wanted to do things. And Pete has come a long way with the real estate industry, and he has some work. And that's why I said it's a teachable moment for business sector to be able to work with him and have him understand why sometimes we don't see things eye to eye. And I single him out because the legislature is not bipartisan, really. I mean, there's very few Republicans in the House and very few Republicans in the Senate. So I say that we have to work with Democrats within our legislative delegation to get them to understand the business perspective. And that is almost harder than working with our friends like the Heises of the world, the Larry Listons. Mark Snyder is also a Democrat from this area, and he's actually been great to work with when you talk to him one-on-one and explain the issues. So that's how I disclaim how an opportunity arises to sit with legislators and talk to them about why we see things a certain way, and it has to transcend partisan politics.
Great. Rachel, is there anybody else you want to single out? I know for the most part, our elected officials down here are pretty pro-business. So, but anybody else specifically?
We have a great delegation. I'd add to the list that Ryan and Clarissa already said, Paul and Dean, senator from the Monument area, has been wonderful. And in the House, Terry Carver is always a really hard worker on behalf of the business community. And, you know, Clarissa mentioned Pete Lee and Mark Snyder, senator and representative respectively. And those two may not always vote our way, but what I respect about both of them is their door's always open. They're always willing to truly listen to where the business community is coming from. And Mark in particular has been instrumental in making some important amendments to bills that we didn't like, that would have been harmful to the business community. And so, you know, as Clarissa said, we would have liked for him to vote the thing down entirely, but he really helped to move the needle.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions still. Emma, what's up next?
Yeah, one question was, is the chamber advocating for the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment? And for those who don't know the details, could you define that and what the selling points would be for repealing Gallagher?
Rachel, do you want to start with that since they specifically mentioned the chamber?
Yeah, so thanks for asking, and I'm sorry to make that clear. We are supportive of repealing the Gallagher Amendment. That's a tricky one. I'll try and keep it simple. This was an amendment, something adopted by voters in 1982, and it requires 45% of the state's property tax base to come from homes, residential properties, 55% from commercial properties. Now that formula may have worked just fine in 1982, but I certainly don't have to tell any of you that home values have risen considerably and rapidly over recent decades. And so what that means is that even as residential property values rise, in order to keep that ratio 45-55, we're pushing down the assessment rate. And so as we push the assessment rate down, you know, it's the classic analogy of the balloon. You poke on it, it's going to push out somewhere else. And so in this case, when we push down the property taxes on residential properties, that means that commercial properties, business owners have been paying more and more and more over the years. That has not only hurt the business community, but it's hurt rural communities or other places where they rely heavily on residential property taxes for schools. And then in turn, that has also forced the state into a situation where it pays 65% of the cost of public education because they've got to backfill what local property taxes aren't covering. And then that in turn means if we're spending more of the state budget on backfilling the cost of education in certain communities, there's less money in the state budget to spend on things like transportation, higher education, both of which we have seen spending on just continue to go down in recent years. So repealing the Gallagher Amendment fixes a variety of those problems. Now that's all rather academic. It's pretty complicated and boring stuff. So, you know, as I said earlier, whether that resonates with voters and whether that can be boiled down to sound bites, I think is a long shot. And again, it essentially means that residential property tax rates will rise a little bit, and that'll be a hard sell as well. But it's a fairness thing.
Great. I think we just have a couple of minutes left, Emma. So do you want to announce the winner of the raffle? And then if we have any closing announcements or comments?
Yep. So the winner of the raffle is Stuart Coppage. So congrats, Stuart. If you want to email me or private message me your address, then I can send you the gift cards that you won. So congratulations. And yeah, we have a couple minutes for announcements. I had sent out an email ahead of time that people who responded yesterday to make an announcement about their company could send me something and send a slide. So I can share that for everyone. And thank you to all the panelists too today, and Kyle for moderating. This was really excellent. 1 second. So we have Pinnacle Financial. Alan, I'm going to unmute you so you can speak about Pinnacle for a second.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, thank you. Alan Bridges with Pinnacle Financial Group. I love supporting small businesses and wanted to say thanks for the Government Affairs Committee, all the work you've done, but we also support our military folks, including the Fort Carson Sergeant Major's Golf Tournament. 2 weeks from tomorrow, if you want to sign up, there's the link. You have to create an account, but go for it. There's as far as the cost for it, if you're wondering about that, it's $65 if you're active duty or retiree, or $75 for civilians. It's a 4-person scramble, and that cost gets you the golf, the cart, range balls, plus breakfast and lunch, and supports stuff like the Fort Carson people support elementary schools locally, holiday food baskets, scholarship for military families, and then support the NCO and Soldier of the Year program. So that's it for Pinnacle Financial Group. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Alan. And then, sorry, I'm just trying to find, Lisa, can you, actually, yeah, can you unmute yourself, Lisa?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Lisa Wise. I'm with Brookdale Senior Living. I do the business development here for all 5 Brookdales in the Springs, as well as El Camino and Pueblo. We're really excited. We are opening up our 2nd level of memory care. It's the only one in Southern Colorado that is offered, and it is called Clarebridge Crossings. Beginning of August, we are launching that floor. It's fully secured. It's beautiful. And it is a very unique person-centered program based on what their passion is. And it's for the early stage of dementia or Alzheimer's. So just, you know, they still can do self-care, all that good stuff. They're very active, but they need to be in a secured community. So we are offering up until Monday, a lease special. If they sign a lease, actually for anyone at Skyline, for independent living, assisted living, both levels of memory care, we've got a lease special that they can get 1 month free this year and then another month free next year, which is a huge savings. That could be at thousands of dollars. So thank you, Lisa Wise, Brookdale Senior Living.
Thanks, Lisa and Alan. Everyone else, thanks so much for joining. Kyle, do you want to say any closing remarks?
Yeah, I just want to make sure the folks who joined us today understand the level of work and effort that Rachel and Shannon and her team and the chamber puts into impacting legislation in our state. And as you can see, you know, Clarissa and Ryan are both on the Government Affairs Committee too, so we have a lot of really, really smart people helping us with all of these things, but it's a lot of effort. And again, the last couple of years and for the next couple of years, it's probably going to feel like we're playing a lot more defense, but they're doing a great job, and I hope you all appreciate it as much as we do. And again, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.